Let's be real here. Say it, dig it, and analyze it. That's Deep Story. Thanks for tuning into Deep Story. I'm MPT. What's the Roman Empire, huh? You hear Roman Empire, and instantly your brain goes 4076 AD, Western Roman Empire falls. Game over, gob. Poof. Just some sad Eastern Roman Empire hanging around, slowly decomposing. That's the vibe we get, right? But hold up, let's break it down. The year 476, nothing magical about it, nada. You wanna say the emperor was a puppet? Oh, buddy. He'd been a puppet for ages, those late Western Roman emperors. Barely more than decorative figurines for the barbarian generals pulling the strings. Now, if we're talking about when the Roman Empire legally kicked the bucket, let me hit you with another date 1918 to 1919. Yep, that's right, after World War I, when three European crowns hit the ground at once. And guess what? All three of those emperors, Germany, Austria Hungary, and even Russia, claimed they were the rightful heirs of the Western Roman Empire. Why? Because each of their titles carried a version of Caesar, the Kaiser of Germany, the Emperor of Austria, and the Tsar of Russia. Yup, Tsar is just Caesar in Russian. How's that for a plot twist? But let's be real, what was Rome actually? Culturally, not Greece. Greece was the Beyonce of ancient cultures, even post defeat. Greek education was the gold standard, so much so that Roman senators would scramble to send their kids to Athens for school. Economically, not even close to Carthage. Those North African merchants, they were the Wall Street wolves of the ancient world. And militarily, Rome wasn't exactly the heavyweight champ. The northern barbarians regularly gave them a run for their denarii. Even early on, Gauls were like, hold my midda. So, what's left? How did Rome rise to greatness? One word, systems. Rome didn't win because of muscle or money. It won because it was the Jeff Bezos of organizational design. Think about it, the Roman legions weren't just armies, they were a walking, talking, spear throwing MBA program. And don't even get me started on Roman law. Ever heard of the 12 tables? That's where it all began. Later on, when the Renaissance rolled around, what's the first thing they revived? Roman law, baby. These guys were the Steve Jobs of building frameworks. Revolutionary, but not one of a kind. Now, here's a trick for understanding history. Follow the big personalities. And who's the star of the Roman show? Julius Caesar, of course. The man's ready-summary is unbeatable. Military conquests from Gaul to Britain, conquering everything the ancient world cared about. And who could forget his mic drop line? I came, I saw, I conquered. Boom! History's first flex. But Caesar wasn't just a fighter, he was also known for his generosity. His motto, if you change, you're one of us. A real team player. So when the Senate decided to pledge allegiance to him in 44 BC, he was like, cool, let's walk into this brave new era together. Our only problem? The man was a little too trusting. He actually believed those Senate snakes. He even disbanded his bodyguards. The day of the fateful meeting, he shows up with a skeleton crew, just a few Pauls, including Mark Antony, his right-hand man. Except Antony got ambushed on the way in, probably with some medieval version of get lost, buddy. So Caesar walks into the Senate basically alone, sits down, and wham, 14 guys surround him. Out come the daggers, and they turn Caesar into a human sieve. 23 stab wounds later, history's greatest general is down for the count. Even in his final moments, Caesar kept that imperial dignity. As he fell, bleeding and betrayed, he pulled his toga over his shattered body, leaving the world with his head held high, well, as high as you can hold it with 23 stab wounds. But his death wasn't just the end of a man, it was the cliff's edge for the Roman Republic. A century of bloodshed and civil war had finally brought a glimmer of stability in Caesar, and then, bam, gone, snatched away. But why did Caesar have to die? What historical weight was he carrying that made his assassination inevitable? To answer that, we need to go back exactly 100 years before his death to 146 BC. Now, 146 BC was a fascinating year. In the East, the Han Dynasty in China was quelling the rebellion of the Seven States. The groundwork for its massive territorial expansion was already being laid, and its institutions were basically ready to roll. Meanwhile, in the West, Rome was riding high, flush with victories, and expanding its empire like it was going out of style. But here's the twist: the systems that had made Rome great were about to become its Achilles heel. You might be thinking, wait, wasn't Rome famous for its institutions? The Senate, consuls, tribunes, those systems were genius, right? Sure, during the Second Punic War, when Hannibal was marching elephants over the Alps and knocking on Rome's door, those systems were chef's kiss. The Senate rallied the people, the consuls coordinated the war effort, everyone pulled together and Rome came out on top. But those same systems, they started to buckle under the weight of Rome's success. See, Rome began as just a little city on the Tiber River. But when it expanded to the point where the Mediterranean Sea became its personal swimming pool, problems started piling up. Governance became a logistical nightmare. Take conquered territories, for example. What do you do with all those people? Let's talk about Rome's allies. These were cities and regions that provided troops, often more troops than Rome itself. At one point, Roman legions numbered about 40,000 soldiers, but Allied forces over 83,000. That's double. And yet, when it came to splitting the spoils of war, Rome was stingier than a kid hoarding Halloween candy. That imbalance eventually sparked a social war, where allies said, enough is enough. And then there were the slaves. Oh, the slaves. Rome's goal to move for war captives was to enslave them. By this point, slaves made up about a third of Italy's population. Imagine that for a second, a republic of just 1 million free citizens trying to manage an empire of over 100 million people, with a significant chunk of them in chains. Even if the slaves weren't outright rebelling, the Romans lived in constant fear. Picture yourself as the only free person in a giant apartment building filled with thousands of enslaved tenants. One little whisper of rebellion, and you're not sleeping at night. This was the fundamental tension of Rome's rise: population, territory, and institutions pulling in opposite directions. And Rome wasn't exactly self sufficient. They couldn't farm worth a damn, and Italy's soil, pretty me. The real breadbasket was Sicily, but oops, Sicily was under Carthaginian control for much of this time. So, yeah, Rome was dealing with a whole lot of big empire problems while still operating like a scrappy little city state. A farming, forget it. The Romans couldn't farm to save their lives. So, what's the backup plan? War, lots of war. For the Romans, warfare was agriculture. Sow the sword, reap the spoils. That was their motto. But once the fighting stopped, how did they split the loot? Oh, they had a system. The rich folks, the ones who could afford horses and weapons, became the knights and generals. The broke folks? They grabbed sticks and lined up as infantry, light or heavy, depending on how much they could scrape together. And there it is, the Roman military's class based structure. Fun fact, the word class comes from this system. Spoils were divided based on effort, or really, based on what you brought to the table. Knights with horses got a big slice, while stick wielding foot soldiers got crumbs. Fair. Sure, in theory. But in practice, this system made capitalism look like a charity bake sale. Over time, the rich got richer and the poor, well, they got screwed. See, in a market economy, the rules can widen the gap between rich and poor. But Rome wasn't just a market economy, it was a loot based economy. And war, being their main income source, made inequality spiral out of control. At first, it wasn't so bad. But as the empire expanded, things got ugly. Ordinary folks who went off to fight couldn't their farms anymore. Let me hit you with some stats. In the late Republic, about 20% of Romans served in the army with an average service of 7 years. 7 years! The old fight a little, farm a little rhythm gone. Soldiers were shipped off to far flung places Asia, Africa, Spain, Gaul. When they came back, they'd find their farms overgrown, their families destitute, or worse, their land sold off. These guys didn't return as heroes, they came back as dirt poor nobodies. And then there's 146 BC, the year Rome decided to go full send and obliterate Carthage. The Third Punic War wasn't just a war, it was a message. They didn't just beat Carthage, they wiped it off the map. But victory came with a catch. Rome's systems, which had been shaky before, now started crumbling under the strain of empire. And it wasn't just Rome versus the newly conquered peoples anymore. A deeper, a nastier divide emerged, the rich versus the poor. Was Rome a state? Honestly, it looked more like a gangster operation. Expansion wasn't driven by some lofty vision, it was just a giant, well organized robbery. Farming, forget it. Italy's soil sucked. Rome's breadbasket was Sicily, but guess what? Sicily was under Carthaginian control for much of this period. So they leaned into what they were good at, fighting and looting. And loot they did. But here's the kicker. As the empire grew, the loot economy broke the social fabric. The rich snapped up land, the poor lost their farms, and inequality went off the charts. By Caesar's time, Rome faced two enormous problems. First, the tension between Romans and everyone they'd conquered. Second, the yawning chasm between the rich and poor within Rome itself. These were ticking time bombs. Without addressing them, Rome was never going to know peace. Let's talk about 146 BC. The Romans pulled off one of the most jaw-dropping feats of their time. They crossed the sea and annihilated Carthage. The Third Punic War wasn't just a military campaign, it was a statement. They didn't just beat Carthage, they leveled the city, salted the earth so nothing would ever grow again, and said, "That's it. This civilization is over." By this point, the Mediterranean was officially a Roman lake, and Rome had hit peak power. But, oh boy, with great power comes some major headaches. The first headache, managing relations with their newly conquered territories. The second, internal class tensions, and trust me, that one was the migraine. The divide between rich and poor in Rome wasn't just growing, it was about to explode. Enter the Gracchus brothers, the first reformers to take a crack at this mess. They were aristocrats with a bold idea: solve inequality by making the rich pay up. Their two big proposals: the grain law, which subsidized wheat for the poor, and the land law, which redistributed land from the wealthy to the landless. Sounds noble, right? But do you think the rich were just gonna roll over and hand over their assets? Yeah, no? The Senate, full of wealthy elites, had the brothers assassinated and tossed their bodies into the Tiber River. The water ran red with their blood. That's how Rome's first attempt at reform ended, in tragedy. And here's the thing about class struggles. When the rich and poor clash, they summon a familiar demon, warlordism. Military leaders are great at exploiting chaos. They show up saying, "Hey, you're hungry, you're oppressed, I've got swords, let's march." And that's exactly what happened in Rome. The next century was a non stop warlord parade, from Marius to Sulla, and then to the first triumvirate of Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar. Rome became a battlefield of egos and armies. Marius, in particular, was a game changer. He introduced something called the Marius stick, a multi-purpose tool that could carry weapons, farming equipment, you name it. His soldiers didn't need central funding. They carried their own supplies, farmed as they marched, and became entirely self sufficient. Independence from the state's purse strings. That's how you get warlords. Marius even marched on Rome itself, slaughtering the Senate and turning the city into a bloodbath. Once the warlord genie's out of the bottle, there's no stuffing it back in. Rome spiraled through wave after wave of civil wars. Marius gave way to Sulla, then Pompey and Crassus, and finally Caesar. Caesar, ever the populist, thrived on the support of the poor. He lived in the slums, styled himself as their champion, and bypassed traditional government by issuing decrees like the grain law and the land law himself. Forget consulting the Senate. Caesar ruled by fiat, leaving the tribunes and consuls in the dust. And Caesar wasn't exactly a rule follower. Cicero would receive letters from minor foreign kings saying, "Thanks for backing me as king. Cicero, you're the best." And Cicero would think, "Wait, what? I didn't back you." Turns out Caesar had been pulling strings behind the scenes, making decisions and slapping the Senate's signature on them like it was no big deal. But here's the rub: strongman politics doesn't last. French historian Montesquieu put it bluntly in his considerations on the causes of the greatness of the Romans and their decline. Even if Caesar hadn't been assassinated, his policies were unsustainable. Why? Because brute force only goes so far. The Senate wasn't just a bunch of old guys in togas, it was the Roman aristocracy with centuries of entrenched power. Sure, Caesar crushed them temporarily, but what happens when Caesar's gone? Or a century later, the backlash was inevitable. Even with Caesar, Rome was teetering. Without him, chaos all over again. Let's set the stage. After Caesar's assassination, chaos erupted. 14 conspirators, led by Brutus, yes, that Brutus, plotted this for months. Brutus didn't just wake up one day and decide to shank his mentor. No, this was a slow cooked betrayal. And here's the kicker: Brutus didn't know Caesar had named him the second heir in his will. Second in line, imagine that. Caesar's dying words, "You too, Brutus." Classic gut punch of guilt right there. But why did Brutus do it? He wasn't some mustache twirling villain. He genuinely believed, hey, we nobles can't let some military strongman stomp all over tradition. So, despite their personal bond, Brutus stabbed Caesar, thinking, sorry, bro, love ya, but Rome comes first. And then what? Brutus and the gang figured the hard part was over. With Caesar gone, it was time for Act Two of their master plan. Brutus even strutted into the forum with a prepared speech. Picture him, parchment in hand, shouting, "The tyrant is dead. Freedom is restored. Let's celebrate." And the crowd's reaction? Crickets. Not a cheer, not a clap, just an awkward silence. Turns out Brutus and his buddies had massively misread the room. They thought they'd be heroes. Instead, they were villains in the public eye. This miscalculation was staggering. Caesar, too, had misjudged the Senate. He believed their oaths of loyalty were sincere, never imagining they were plotting his murder. And the Senate, they thought Rome would rally to them after Caesar's death. Wrong again. Both sides were utterly out of touch with the people's sentiment. Meanwhile, Mark Antony was busy making moves. He held a funeral for Caesar at his estate, complete with a public reading of Caesar's will. And what was in the will? Oh, just a little bombshell. Caesar left every Roman citizen 300 sesterces, a generous chunk of change back then. The crowd went wild. Caesar loved us. Even in death, he's giving us money. Their grief turned into rage. They grabbed torches, stormed the Senate, and started hunting down the assassins. The city descended into chaos. Amid this turmoil, Caesar's designated heir emerged, Octavian, later known as Augustus, the first emperor of Rome. But back then, he was just a 19-year-old kid. Let's be real. Octavian didn't exactly scream, future ruler. He was young, inexperienced, and physically unimpressive at just 5'9", which, by Roman standards, might as well have been hobbit height. He was constantly sick, plagued by stomach issues, and came from a family that wasn't particularly noteworthy. Even his name, Octavian, literally means ETH in Latin, not exactly a name that screams destiny. His connection to Caesar, distant at best, he was just Caesar's great nephew. And to top it off, he had no public support and no military backing. The odds definitely not in his favor, but the Octavian wasn't about to roll over. He clung to Caesar's will like a lifeline and through sheer determination wobbled his way onto the political stage. His challenges were enormous. He had to navigate the resentment between Romans and the provinces, tackle the growing wealth gap, and somehow keep the peace in a city that had just been set on fire figuratively and literally. Oh, and let's not forget, he had Caesar's corpse hanging over him both as a legacy and a burden. So, what did Octavian do? He latched onto a key ally, Agrippa. Agrippa was a military genius, the kind of guy you wanted in your corner during a bar fight or, a civil war. They were inseparable, best bros for life. But Octavian wasn't naive. He knew the dangers of a powerful general. Subtly, he kept Agrippa on a leash. For example, soldiers in the Roman army would often cheer for their leaders, shouting titles like master or comrade. But for Agrippa, nope, he was only allowed to hear warriors and statues. Octavian didn't let Agrippa get too many of those either. It's a fascinating dynamic, trust mixed with constant vigilance. Agrippa was Octavian's right hand, but Octavian made sure that hand never got too close to the throne. Let's dig into this dynamic between Octavian and Agrippa. These two were born in the same year, yet in every Roman sculpture you'll see, Agrippa is always carved as an older man, gray hair, 50-something vibes. Meanwhile, Octavian, eternal 30-something, a perpetual image of youth and vigor. What's the message here? Simple, stick with me, I'm young, I'm the future. Never mind that Octavian's body was falling apart while Agrippa was the real picture of health. Octavian wasn't just playing to the crowd, he was playing Agrippa like a maestro. He married Agrippa into his family, saying, Buddy, let's seal the deal. You and me, besties forever. Marry into my family, give me a son, and boom, that's our heir. Now you can stop worrying about power struggles because we're tied to the same chariot. Call me Dad. This was Octavian's genius move to eliminate the threat of military strongmen challenging the Roman political system. Agrippa wasn't just an ally, he was locked in as family. This was Octavian's playbook. So after Antony's dramatic fall, Octavian waltzed into the Senate and said, Guys, I've been thinking, let's bring back the Republic. I mean, come on, who wants to end up like Caesar, stabbed to death? Messy business, right? The Senate, exhausted and humiliated after years of being bossed around by Caesar's successors, practically fell over themselves to agree. Republic. Yes, please. Sounds amazing. And then, as a little thank you, they gave Octavian a new title just 3 days later, Augustus. Now, Augustus today screams emperor. But back then, it was more like a big pat on the back. In Latin, it roughly meant awesome, majestic, or just super cool. It wasn't a formal title with administrative meaning, it was a vibe, a status flex. You the man that with domestic affairs under control, Octavian shifted focus to the borders. Rome's edges were chaotic rebellions, barbarians, constant warfare. So Octavian came up with a brilliant scheme. Here's the deal, he said. Let's divide the empire into two zones. All the rich, stable, peaceful provinces. Senate's problem. Go ahead, govern them. Appoint your governors, enjoy your luxury. I'm not interested. But all the frontier provinces, the wild, poor, dangerous ones, those are mine. I'll take care of them. And I'll make sure Rome stays safe. The Senate couldn't believe their luck. You want to take the messiest, most unprofitable parts of the empire. Be our guest. So Octavian got what he wanted, control of the frontiers and, crucially, the legions stationed there. Remember, the Roman military was spread along the borders. By taking the frontiers, Octavian secured direct command of the army. What was the trade-off? Octavian said, You get wealth and stability. I get the army. The Senate happily handed over military authority. Why not? They didn't want to deal with the headaches of war or the frontier's instability. But this arrangement created something revolutionary, a consolidated military power in the hands of a single man, Augustus. And that was Octavian's second big move. Step one was to establish his authority. Step two was to trade power with the Senate. Step three, well, now he had to decide how to play his hand. Would he go all in and consolidate everything? Or would he play it cool, letting the Senate think they still had a stake in the game? It was time for Octavian to shuffle the deck and set the rules for a whole new empire. Octavian, or Augustus as he became known, didn't just seize power, he rewrote the rules of the game. Let's talk about one of his genius moves, the introduction of inheritance tax. Now, inheritance taxes are not popular. Imagine it, a family is mourning their loved one, and here comes the taxman with his hand out. But Augustus, he sold it differently. You're not paying me, he said. You're funding the standing army. Surely you want to keep Rome safe, right? And just to sweeten the deal, he'd often say, if there's a shortfall, I'll cover it out of my own pocket. Where did this pocket money come from? Egypt. After its conquest, Egypt became Augustus's personal piggy bank. He also raked in private donations and had a hefty fortune of his own. When the aristocrats saw Augustus throwing his own wealth into public projects, they had no choice but to follow suit. Augustus turned taxing the rich into a game of keeping up appearances, and he was winning. This wasn't just about rules. It was about setting the tone, the vibe, if you will. Augustus understood that politics wasn't a chess match, cold, calculating, winner takes all. No, he turned it into a poker game. A bit of bluffing, a bit of strategy, and a whole lot of camaraderie. On the surface, everyone was chatting, laughing, and swapping stories even as the stakes were sky high. Early Augustus, ruthless. Late Augustus, the man was as cuddly as a lamb. He made regular appearances in the Senate, giving speeches, enduring heckling, and even stomping off in frustration now and then. There was always some loudmouth senator who'd stand up and nitpick his policies, shouting, I oppose this. It drove him nuts, but he played along. His stepson and successor, Tiberius, once wrote him a letter asking, Why do you tolerate these idiots? Augustus replied, Oh, it's fine. So long as they're not drawing swords on me, I can live with a little grumbling. He had created a political environment where debate was noisy but safe. Everyone could play their part without fearing for their lives. Here's the kicker: all those fancy titles the Senate gave him, they thought they were worthless. Augustus, first citizen, father of the nation, triumphant general, just a bunch of flattering labels to placate the guy, right? But Augustus was no fool. He banked those worthless titles, and before long, they became the very symbols of his authority. Why? Because Augustus was the only person in Rome who commanded both the love of the people and the respect of the Senate. Those titles, meaningless at first, piled up into something extraordinary. They became the banners under which all factions united. Augustus wasn't just a ruler, he was the moral compass, the mediator of conflicts, and the ultimate arbiter of disputes. So, how did the Principate, rule of the first citizen, morph into outright imperial rule? Augustus pulled it off by respecting the forms of the Republic while quietly taking all the real power. He controlled the military, secured the finances, and crafted a public image that was untouchable. And that image, built from the Senate's worthless accolades. By the time Augustus was done, he wasn't just a man. He was an institution, a symbol, a living legend. That's how a kid from nowhere, with a shaky claim to power, became the first emperor of Rome. After watching Octavian, better known as Augustus, play his political hand, it's clear that his success wasn't just luck. His grand reform of Rome's political system was like a masterful poker game, and winning that game took more than just holding good cards. He had to play them perfectly. What made Augustus's combination punch so effective? Let's break it down. First, a clear goal. Augustus knew exactly what he wanted: stability for Rome and control for himself. No ambiguity, no half measures. He wasn't just reacting to crisis, he was building a new system. Second, unshakable resolve. Rome was a mess after decades of civil war, and Augustus faced constant opposition from senators, generals, and even some of the people. But his determination never wavered. He didn't flinch under pressure, no matter how tough the game got. A third, flexibility. Augustus wasn't rigid. He adjusted his strategy depending on who he was dealing with. Ruthless with his enemies, gentle with the Senate, generous with the people. He bent just enough to avoid breaking. Fourth, supreme skill. This guy was a political virtuoso. Whether it was redefining taxes, managing the military, or handling public relations, Augustus played his cards with finesse. He didn't just beat his opponents, he made them think they'd won something too. A fifth, a shared bottom line. Augustus understood that everyone at the table had to walk away with something. The Senate got its dignity back, on paper, at least. The people got stability and bread. The military got clear orders and steady pay. Everyone was invested in the system's success. A sixth, rule-making genius. Augustus didn't just change the game, he wrote the rule book. Inheritance taxes, military reforms, the division of provinces. These weren't just policies, they were foundations for a new Rome. He knew a stable empire needed a framework, and he built it from scratch. Seventh, moral authority. Augustus didn't just want to rule Rome, he wanted to embody it by projecting humility, emphasizing tradition, and earning trust. He became not just the head of state, but the heart of the nation. His titles might have been symbolic at first, but they became the source of his unmatched legitimacy. A politician with all 7 of these cards in their hand. That's a royal flush. And when Augustus laid down his cards, the message was clear: I win.